the reason we're here today is talk about instructional design, performance improvement, and OPWL. And that involves things we do as performance improvement practitioners. And so just as a sample of those, I threw up copies of the performance improvement model that people are seeing in 536, and a different version of that model that Dr. Marker and I put together along with one of our graduate students, Deanne Allen, and the Bronco ID model, which is the centerpiece in the OPWL 537 instructional design course. Our agenda for today is I'd like to introduce myself and tell you a little bit about how I came to Boise State, talk about the courses I teach, talk about some ID related topics that students will have been addressing in 536. My knowledge of 535 is a little less, but I'll do my best to do the same thing there and hope that our students who are taking 535 can help me out there. And my plan for today is to spend most of our time focusing on expectations and preparation for the OPWL 537 instructional design course. One of the fun things about our field is that we're relatively new, and pretty much no one I know grew up as a small child saying, I want to be a performance improvement practitioner, or I want to be an instructional designer. We all have these circuitous paths that kind of take us to where we were going. And so I started off as an English major. I graduated summa cum laude and then realized that the only job I could land was in a book bindery for minimum wage. And thank goodness my wife helped me find a job at a community college where I started tutoring composition and then started teaching composition classes. And I did that for a while. That job kind of dried up, so I completed a master's degree at what was then called, at the University of Northern Colorado, in what was then called Computer Technology and Education, and later on became the Educational Technology Program. As I started completing that master's program, I did an internship at IBM, and the internship was an amazing experience. I learned two different things. One, IBM and I at that time did not belong together at all. It was not a good match. But what I did learn is that I really liked doing stuff in the workplace, and I really liked doing work with adult learners. And as that internship ended and I was finally able to graduate with my master's degree, I had my first job as a junior instructional designer. It was with a company called McDonnell Douglas. They were a defense contractor, and later on, Boeing bought them. And I worked there for almost a year and a half, 2 years, and realized that that match wasn't really good. And I found a job with a small consulting firm named DLS Group. And I stayed with them for 20 years. I came in as a junior ID, became a senior ID, later on became the chief learning officer. And DLS Group was cool because we were an early adopter of performance improvement. And so I got to do a lot of work as an ID and a lot of work as a performance improvement consultant. And then in 2007, I joined the faculty here at Boise State University, and I love this gig. One thing that has pretty much been with me throughout the work here at DLS Group and at Boise State is, for me, it's all about delivering valued behavior change in the workplace. It's about helping organizations meet their business goals. And when we align with things like that, we tend to do better work than when we merely act as order takers for training requests. As I mentioned earlier, I teach 537. 537, and I'll be teaching 551 in the fall. These are fun courses to teach. One of the things that I am very proud of in the OPWL department is even when we were teaching instructional design or e-learning content design, we do that within the larger context of performance improvement. And so we're always tying back to the idea that training is a particular intervention. It's useful when people lack skill and knowledge. If there are other causes of performance gaps, we use other solutions and put them together in ways that close those gaps and help organizations meet their business goals. And that'll be a theme across all of those courses there, is how do we do that in ways that clients will value. One of the things you'll see about me is that even though I've been faculty since 2007, I'm still a consultant at heart. And as a consultant, I'm mercenary. And the reason that people find us valuable is we help them do things that help them sleep at night. And the performance improvement angle is what helps our clients sleep at night. And that'll be wrapped across all of those courses I'm teaching. And performance improvement will be wrapped across all of the courses in OPWL. This is the next part of the presentation. And I wanted to link some of the things in 536 to some of the things in 537, and I'm going to try to do the same thing with 535, although I know Dr. Giacomo is revising parts of that course, and I'm going to rely on the people who are in that course to help me make some of the links. So I know that one of the things in 536 that you start working on and then later on works into 537 is, Meagher's three-part objective. The performance, what is it that you want people to do, the conditions, under what circumstances they will do that. Conditions are usually about cues that initiate performance. You do this when, and resources that people use to complete the performance. Here's the stuff that you use. And the last part of those Meagher style objectives are criteria. What defines doing it well? What are the standards the performance needs to meet? In 537, we wrap a magic phrase around those objectives. And the magic phrase is on the job. So what do you want people to do on the job? Under what circumstances will they do that on the job? And what defines doing it well on the job? And so those job-focused objectives are one of the course deliverables. In addition, I know in 536, you're being introduced to Gagne's 9 events, and there are some connections between Gagne and Merrill. And per Matt's question, there are other connections with ISPI. Meagher, I'm assuming objectives, but maybe Meagher and Pipe's cause analysis model. Gilbert and Gary Rumler. I didn't know Tom Gilbert. I have met Meagher and Gary Rumler. In fact, my old boss at DLS Group can't find it anymore, but at one point we had a picture of Deborah squeezing Bob Meagher's knee and Bob Meagher smiling very broadly. I never understood why she needed to squeeze his knee, but she did. Gary Rumler was one of the most consummate consultants I'd ever met in my life. He was really smart and very smooth. And I guess Matt's starting to ask, what are the connections between HPT and ID? So let me try to answer that several ways. In 536, you're introduced to Gagne's 9 events, and then I understand that you use Merrill's first principles as a reflection activity for the 9 events. The thing about the 9 events is Gagne comes up with those really as part of the connectionist movement. You know, computers and had come into play and started, influencing how people think about learning. Program and instruction was really big and had a large influence on the field. And essentially, um, Gagne, put together what at the time was the mother of all lesson plans. Only now we call it the mother of all reusable objects. And those were the 9 events. And it's a pretty, cool thing. I can teach just about anything by working through those 9 events. Sometimes I can combine them, but essentially, if I create instruction that has those things, then I'm going to be creating pretty tight instruction that will produce learning, and I should facilitate skill transfer to the workplace. Um, but stuff happened after Gagne's 9 events, and a lot of that stuff happened as the cognitive psychologist gained prominence, and we started paying a lot more attention to how people solve problems. And that was really important because the nature of work and the workplace changed because we had the rise of the knowledge worker. And knowledge workers are essentially people who solve problems for a living. And it used to be knowledge work was all white collar. Uh, and one of the things that we've seen happening now is that everyone's a knowledge worker. We used to say knowledge work was white collar or management kind of jobs, and blue collar jobs were all the craft jobs, all the worker jobs. But we know now when you have assembly line workers who are parts of quality teams and who can close down assembly lines, stop them because something isn't wrong, everybody's a knowledge worker, everyone's a problem solver. And Merrill's first principles are an update to Gagne's 9 events. And Merrill essentially completed a brilliant review of the literature and synthesized everything up till that point. And he said, well, if we really want to have lesson plans, and those lesson plans are going to do a better job at focusing on problems, we're going to look at structuring lesson plans that have places for activation, demonstration, application, and integration. So Gagne's 9 events are essentially a precursor to Merrill's first principles. The other thing that you learn about in 536 is Keller's ARCS model. So, Keller is arguing that it's important to have good instructional design, but your instructional design ought to also have a good motivational design. And that involves gaining and maintaining attention, showing what's in it for the learners, building confidence, and producing satisfaction in the learning experience. What's nice is that Keller's model and Merrill's first principles work pretty nicely together. And in the 537 course, you'll be applying them both. Now, Matt asked earlier about the connections between HPT and ID. So I'm going to quickly flash to the beginning. And in this initial graphic, the Van Team et al. Graphic that appears in this upper left hand, the performance improvement model, everything that is typically happening in ID. And one of the ways that we characterize that is using the Addy family of models. Addy short for what? That's my question from me to you. What does Addy stand for? Can you put that in the chat window? Or can somebody unmute themselves and tell me?
Great, we got a brave Tammy here. Thanks, Tammy.
Thank you, Tammy. Yeah, so Addy is just a shorthand. It's a mnemonic based on the different phases that people complete as they create instructional design. Those Addy phases typically happen here in intervention, selection, design, and development. One of the things that we do in our ID course is we situate ID within a larger framework of performance improvement. So we do some tweaking in that in the instructional design course. You're also going to complete a performance analysis, which is this first big part of the Addy model that appears in the upper left corner. And in that performance analysis, you're going to be doing several things. First, you're going to be framing a performance gap. What's the difference between existing and desired performance? You're also going to be completing an organizational analysis where you demonstrate that that gap is aligned with strategic business objectives and that the gap is worth closing. You'll also have to indicate that at least one of the causes of the performance gap arises from a lack of skill. And so in the ID world, when people put a performance analysis and combine that with the rest of Addy, it's sometimes called A square DDIE. So performance analysis, training analysis, design, development, implement, and evaluate. So we do ID within the larger context of improving performance. So that's one way of looking at that. The other way of looking at this is the kinds of projects that people do. So, for example, the Idaho Humane Society has been a sponsor of a number of ID projects. And essentially, our Boise State students have written the training that their volunteers use to process incoming shelter dogs, to take those dogs for walks, to read their body language, to match the right dog to the right people in the right setting, to match the right cat to the right people in the right settings, and the training that they use for taking care of rabbits, little bunnies. Yes, we do bunnies too. In the training for the dog selection, what that team found when they did that performance analysis is that, yeah, it really is hard to learn a little bit about the people who want to adopt a dog, learn a little bit about those people, look at the dog and its temperament, its characteristics, look at the place where they have in mind to take the dog, and do that match in a way that benefits everybody, which is what's called the forever home. And the student team who worked with the Humane Society to do that found that there were a variety of performance gaps, or a variety of causes for that performance gap. We want to have more dogs finding their forever home faster. And they found that one of the causes of the performance gap lay in the environment, and that essentially people did not know what the process was to adopt a dog. And to address that gap, they put together signage, little signs on how the dog adoption process works. They also put together a form that helps families or potential adopters specify what they were looking for in a dog. They also modified the internal process that the Humane Society uses to note dog temperament and so on, so that when families go through the kennels, they're able to quickly scan information about each dog and start finding potential matches for the people who are involved. And then they put together a little job aid, a little cheat sheet, if you will, that they actually use to collect information about the family, the dog, and to um, show the family several potential matches, and then to help the family take the dog out on a walk. So there was a lot of signage, there were some job aids, and the training boiled down to one piece part of how to do that matching magic. And a lot of our projects turn into that part where we're calling it training, but it's training plus a lot of other performance improvement stuff. So, Matt, does that answer your question? How we situate instructional design within the larger framework of improving performance?
And Steve, just to clarify,
Yes.
the students in your class, in the ID class, did all of that, right?
They did all of that.
So instructional design was really seen as what was required to solve that problem, not just the
Yes.
piece of designing this training.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. So, what typically happens in the instructional design course is that as part of this initial performance analysis, teams do some rooting around, they do some detective work, and odds are the cause or causes of any performance gap are actually going to be traveling around in packs. There isn't going to be just a single cause. Odds are that there are going to be multiple causes of a performance problem. And the question becomes, how do we address all of those? And so what typically happens is that as part of that ID course, the ID team will say, we take responsibility for addressing causes of the performance gap that arise because of a lack of skill, and will also create any job aids related to that. And then they say the client will be responsible for addressing these other causes, and this is what we suspect that they are. The reason we do that is what happens if an organization has a performance gap, and let's say there are 5 causes of the performance gap, and we only address 3 or 4 of them. Have we closed the performance gap? Can either answer using your mics or using the chat window. If we don't address all of the causes of the performance gap, have we closed the gap? Ed's right, we haven't. And so that's a due diligence thing that we employ in the course. So in another course, we did training for a local nonprofit that works with the families of kids who were in the hospitals. And what we found for them is that they had lofty service standards, but nobody knew what they meant. Because the language is really abstract. So the student team got in there and, coming out of their analysis, they were able to collect stories that showed what service standards look like when you work with families who aren't at their best because they're under high stress. Their kids are in the hospital. They're not necessarily the easiest people to work with because they're dealing with something that's far more critical than, being polite or being receptive or being courteous. How do you work with people like that, knowing that what you do is really important? And so their training ended up being, more about, putting people into role play situations where they were working with, role play family members who were under stress, who were impatient, and so on, in ways where, when that happened, as it inevitably does, it doesn't freak them out. And with them, the other part of the performance improvement solution became further definition of what those standards actually mean. Other parts of that performance improvement solution became ongoing feedback because part of the solution was to write down acts of incredible performance, above service standards above and beyond, and those became part of the feedback that everyone got in the organization. So typically what we see in our projects in the ID course is that, yes, there's an element there of using instructional design to address skill gaps. But we often touch on other causes of the gap because instructional design itself, can be a hard sell in organizations. It's a lot easier to sell performance improvement that aligns with business goals. The per the question that let me scroll up. Tammy asked about Addy and leaving Addy for Sam. Sam is a ID approach coming from Allen Communications, and it is their generations of ID models. Rob Fauché and Bob Tennyson characterized them. And they call Addy a third generation instructional design model. And then they point to the emergence of a variety of fourth generation models. So if you look at the performance improvement model and the Bronco ID model that we use in OPWL 537, you'll see that those models are primarily kind of linear. You do a whole bunch of stuff in a phase, and then you move on to the next phase, and then you move on to the next phase. And yes, there's a lot of crosstalk between those things, but essentially you complete each phase in that order. If you look at the spiral human performance improvement process that Dr. Marker and I created with Deanne Allen, you'll see that there's a lot of overlapping. Everything's overlapping. And it's just that at sometimes you're looking at some things more than others. So at the beginning of a project, you're doing a lot of analysis, but you're still thinking about what does evaluation look like? What does implementation and change management look like? What does intervention, selection, design, and development look like? And how will we do all of this in a way that we can maintain it when we're done? And the way that you do that is through iterative prototyping, which is, these spirals that work their way through the model. And the idea of prototyping is that these are mock-ups of what we think the end product looks like. And as we move through the course of the project, the prototypes become increasingly detailed, so that by the time we're done with this kind of combination analysis and design, we have a pretty good idea of what we're going to do in development. And so the SAM model uses a lot of prototyping. It uses some project management up front and what they call a savvy project start, which is a mechanism for doing kickoff meetings. They use a lot of prototyping. They use a lot of usability testing. And we talk about those things in the OPWL 547 course. We also talk about what's called personas, which are representations of people in the target population that you base on data that you collect about the population. So in the 547 course, we use things that appear in SAM. There's another variation of SAM out there called Llama, which is short for a lot like Agile. And I'm not sure how Llama came out of that a lot like Agile thing. And to date, in that course, the other thing that we spend some time talking about is Agile project management and Agile programming, the way that software engineers actually do it, because there's typically a big difference between the way IDs want to approach the world and everybody else in the enterprise approaches the world. We're still pretty bound to Addy. And even though Alan calls what they do leaving Addy for SAM, SAM is still pretty linear. And Agile itself is not nearly that linear. And so in the 537 course, I asked students, do you want to keep focused the way the course is on personas, rapid iterative prototyping, and usability testing? Or should we use something like SAM or a lot like Llama? Or should we, jump in and start figuring out how to do ID using Agile programming? And so far, the consensus, including students who've taken the Addy for SAM webinars and training, is that they want to keep 547 as it is. Did I answer that question?
So while we're waiting for a student response there, Steve, this is Linda. Let me just pop in for a minute. Because one of the questions that I heard from students in 536 was, encountering Addy, was that they'd seen announcements and articles for things like, leaving Addy for SAM, and,
Yeah.
is Addy dead? And
Yeah.
sort of wondering, wondering, am I learning really old stuff that's no longer relevant? What's up with this?
That's a great question. And the answer is no, you're not. When I started here in Boise State. One of the earlier research projects I was involved in was with Dr. Marker and a graduate assistant named Kevin Taylor. And we took the Addy phases, we took Addy steps, and we replicated research that Marty Tesmer earlier did. And essentially, we asked a whole bunch of IDs at ISPI whether or not they did those phases and those activities in each phase. So essentially, if you look at the Bronco ID model that's on the right side of this first slide, we asked them, do you expect newly hired novice instructional designers to be able to do these things? And then we said, how satisfied are you with their work? And what we found is that the people who employ entry-level IDs expect them to do all of those things, and by and large, they're largely dissatisfied with people's ability to do that. Now, we're currently replicating that study. I'm working with Dr. Giacomo to do that, along with another colleague, and we're wanting to see if that's still the case. I know the other reason that this stuff is still valuable is that the mindset in the 547 course is you use SAM, you use personas, rapid prototyping, usability testing, primarily as a way to handle project risk. And so when the organization is doing things it's never done before, when they've never used the technology, when the project is complex and you haven't done stuff like that before, there's a lot of risk there. And things like SAM, Llama, Agile, the strategies that we focus on in 547, all of those are about handling those really risky projects. And essentially, you do that by combining a lot of analysis and design and a little bit of development so that you're doing more of them in parallel, the way that this Villachica, Marker, Villachica, and Allen model suggest. And you do that up through design, and the point at which you take the design and the final prototypes and you do a test of those. What you've done is you've set up an assembly line. And at that point, you go into Addy and you churn and burn development. And you do that by being able to continuously improve efficiencies, as opposed to what often happens in Addy when there's too much project risk and you start finding out things in development that you should have learned about in analysis and design. So in terms of our consulting work at DLS Group, our whole idea, especially with new risky projects, was to use things like rapid prototyping, usability testing, and so on, to quickly set up an assembly line and then move to Addy for design, implementation, evaluation. And so we use both models intentionally. Did that answer your question, Linda?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and I think it's really important. You know, when people are out there scanning the literature and getting email blasts from, you know, e-learning guild and different journals with
Yes.
some of these headlines, you know, having it grounded in the reality of what work is like is really important. So thank you.
And the other thing is, I'll need to verify this with Joanne, but most of the job postings that I see and I think she sees, because we talk a lot about this, are still mentioning Addy.
Ah, interesting.
Uh, and, you know, I know that's anecdotal data. With that, what,
Yeah, Catherine's echoing that.
yes, I'm going to go to 537 expectations. These are the things that I know I expect, and I think I am speaking for Dr. Conley on this as well. And if not, I'm sure he'll let me know. But the expectations for 537, um, the course focuses on skills training. So we're helping people perform job tasks, and we're helping people perform those tasks in ways that the organization will value. It's about helping organizations meet business goals. Now, I know that there are other forms of training. You know, you may have seen diversity training, you may have seen awareness training. Um, there are other forms of training that fly under other names. The 537 course doesn't address those, and that's intentional. The reason is that there are two reasons. One is that if you can create good performance based skills training, you can quickly create other types of training. The second reason is that um, our targeting on skills is that skills translate into job tasks, and job tasks translate into what people do in the workplace. And by focusing on those skills people need, that clients will value, that clients' bosses will value, we start turning away from an inherent problem in instructional design. Kathy Moore, who's one of my positive role models, talks about, are you a course factory? And it's asking a question whether your ID group are merely order takers for training requests. Somebody comes in and says, I need me some training. One of the things that I know you get out of 536 is the realization that anytime there's a gap between actual and desired performance, and that gap is worth closing, there could be a variety of causes. And trainings or a lack of skill is one of the causes only about 10% or so of the time, 15% of the time. And there are lots of other things we can do to improve performance. And so we look at focusing on performance by delivering valued skills rather than information dumps that nobody values. In the 537 course, there'll be a real ID project. You'll work on a team with other students, a virtual team, with that real world client against a schedule and produce ID deliverables. So it's a real world ID project, and it should be something that would be a good piece not only for your portfolio defense, uh, if you're part of the master's program here, but also a good portfolio piece for your individual portfolio that you use to get work or seek promotions. You'll be working on virtual ID teams. One of the things that has happened recently in the course is that it's pretty common for each of these student ID teams to have at least one person who's on site and is often acting as a liaison between the rest of the ID team and the client. But we're seeing an increasing number of projects where there is no on site liaison. So we just had a student team that created training for people at the rec center here at Boise State on how to field the questions that they typically get. And on that team, there was no one who lived here in Boise, and they did all of that stuff related to the project virtually. And because we're seeing an increasing use of virtual teams in the workplace, um, this kind of arrangement can only become increasingly common over time. In the course, there are 9 ID project deliverables, and they correspond to that bid model, the Boise ID model, and you'll get 2 passes at each one of those deliverables. There are also some project status reports and some team meetings with either me or Dr. Conley or whoever the instructor is going to be. That means there are going to be a lot of moving parts. And ID teams are going to have to manage those moving parts. The course is about evidence-based decision making. And so, you know, unlike other training that appears in the workplace and other training you may have suffered through on your own, we don't simply make this stuff up. In performance analysis, in learner analysis, in task analysis. We go out into the field and we collect analysis data that can come from the client, that can come from learners, that can come from exemplary performers, that can come from other stakeholders in the organization. And then teams use that collected data for making design decisions and other decisions about how their training will work. And so the training is based on data collected from the field, which in my consulting experience goes well with clients. This training is about helping other people in your organization perform more like your best. And to create this training, we're going to embed with your best performers. We're going to represent what it is they do so other people in your organization can act more like them. The other thing in the course is that the course uses a series of templates for each of those deliverables. And those templates largely align with industry practice. You see these kinds of templates appearing in other ID text and in articles about how people do ID. The other thing that pleases me about the course is that there are people who complete the course and then ask for permission to use the templates at their workplace. Joe Harless once quipped that you know you've created a good job aid when everyone wants a copy of it, and we're going to take the same attitude with the templates. One of the other things that happens is because there are 9 project deliverables and we're using a systematic approach where the output of one deliverable often becomes one or more of the inputs of the next, ID teams typically slip schedule and then they recover it. And it happens, and most teams do it, and by and large, it works out okay. One reason it works out okay is because the design of the course is set up around weekly discussion activities that are primarily individual, that help individual team members start building the skills they need for the ID project. And then together, the weekly discussion activities and the team-based ID project activities prepare students to complete the final exam, which they will complete independently, working on their own and flying solo. Are there any questions about the expectations? Do they seem fair? I know that these are the expectations that I would expect in people I would hire as a chief learning officer and as a senior ID. And when people couldn't meet these expectations, it was a reason why we got rid of them, and I was part of getting rid of them. It was interesting. We had people coming in with PhDs, some of whom could do these things and some of whom could not. And so these are the things that we valued in our consulting experience, but these are the things that our research suggests that people value in IDs as well. And Catherine commented, there's a big deal of group work, and yes, and that's because a lot of ID is group work. I understand that there are people who are still Lone Ranger IDs. I think there are fewer of them. And when you realize that you may be a solo ID, but you still have to work with the client, you still have to work with the subject matter expert, you still may need to work with other stakeholders, you're already doing a lot of group work. And when you do ID in other situations, for example, in my consulting work, we did a lot of projects within the national security environment, within that Department of Defense group. IDs, there were different levels of IDs. There were junior IDs, there were senior IDs, project managers, and we worked as teams of IDs. But as teams of IDs, we also worked with other people who may be videographers, who may be graphic artists, other people who were on the management side of the project and maybe providing accounting information about where we were and so on. So I think one of the lessons coming out of 537, but I think your other OPWL project courses is that everything we do in performance improvement is group work. And if you're trying to do that solo, odds are it's a red flag of danger. But thanks for that comment, Catherine.
So, Steve, this is Linda, and I'm imagining that for some people thinking about that, when they think about group work, they're thinking about additional hours. And so maybe you could comment just a little bit on what happens in terms of scoping so that people when looking at the project as a whole aren't biting off something that actually needs a year's work.
Scoping is hard. And one of my jobs as instructor, and um, is to ensure that we scope the size of that project adequately. So I will work with every ID team to scope that project, because what typically happens is that what the ID team has in mind about what they can do is much bigger than the course requirement. The course requirement is to design 2 to 3 hours of training. Typically, ID teams will start off with what could be much, much more than those 2 to 3 hours. And so it's my job to work with that team to come to arrive at a scope that will do good by the client, but primarily will meet the learning outcomes of the course. And that is to make sure that we don't do more than that 2 to 3 hours of training design that we're going to promise the client. So that's one way we handle scope. The other way that we look at handling scope is one of the things that I ask students to do in the 537 course is to put together a team charter where you specify as a team how you're going to work together. Part of that is going to be about how the team will communicate and how the team will collaborate. And if you have a plan in place for teamwork and collaboration, it's my experience that teams who start with a plan for how we're going to do that and then continuously reflect on how well they're doing that, and then make adjustments and tweaks so that they do that more efficiently, end up outperforming teams that don't spend as much time thinking about how are we going to collaborate and communicate. They tend to, the teams that reflect on this stuff tend to have better and more focused team meetings. They get more things done. They're able to get better inputs out of their clients and so on. So I think between my help in scoping the project and a team's own efforts in terms of actively saying, here's how we're going to play together to deliver a success story, I think those are two of the very powerful mechanisms for managing scope. And moreover, I think those will be powerful mechanisms in managing scope in workplace ID projects.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. In terms of how to prepare for the 537 course, one thing I would look at is, as with all of the OPWL project courses, I am humbled and amazed by the balancing acts our students are able to pull off to complete the degree in our courses. This is one of those courses where uh, I'm sure that you're already doing it, but as the course begins and as you start wrapping your head around the syllabus and the schedule that you'll need to use to complete the course and produce those ID deliverables, you want to look at how you're going to be balancing the course demands with other demands on your time. The other thing about the ID course is that this is a real ID project with a real ID client. And so to give us more time to scout out good projects before the course starts, we start the course actually the Wednesday before the official start of classes. We call that Startup Week. I encourage all of you, when you take that course, to get in there on Startup Week and take advantage of what's going on as those discussions start to identify and then qualify potential projects. So one of the things that we'll be doing on our end is we'll be posting on the Opal website a little flyer that I use when I scope projects for that course. And I encourage you to scout potential projects well before that course starts. And if you're in my section of the course and you think you've got a good idea, feel free to contact me before the course starts. Typically, we need to come up with about 12 or so potential projects to find the 3 to 5 that the course will actually pursue. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, a lot of the initial ideas people have for training really aren't going to be good training candidates because there's not really a skill gap. Quite often, if you just put a good job aid out there, you can get the performance you want without incurring training cost. So, one reason why we have to come up with so many potential projects is that a lot of them aren't really going to be training projects. They're going to be really good job aids projects, but that's not the focus of this course. The other reason we have to scout out a lot of potential projects is that when you do skill-based training, and the idea is to help everyone in the organization act more like its best, you can't do that working alone. This is another one of those group things. And this is, working with a client, and clients have to have skin in the game. And that little flyer specifies those client responsibilities. And what we find sometimes is, yes, it could be a really good ID project, but if we don't have a client who can provide adequate sponsorship, that project won't move forward. So one of the things that you can do to prepare is to scout potential projects before the course starts. Adam asked, how large are the teams? My preference for ID teams are 3 to 4 people. Those team sizes work well. 5 people is too many. Folks start getting in each other's way. And 2-person teams can work, but they are less resilient because if anything bad happens to one of the teammates, the ID course is just too big for one person to do alone. Adam, did I answer your question? How are they assigned? We have a qualification process where first we vet the potential projects. And once we have a list of projects that have qualified, we ask people to rank their preferences for the projects. And then we try to put them on teams that match their highest ranked preferences. We don't always do that simply because everybody's got to be on a team. So hopefully that answers your question, Jer. If not, please follow up. Catherine asked, will we be incorporating e-learning training? The answer is yes, you can. So the course ends with a detailed instructional plan, and that plan could be for instructor-led classroom training. It could be for instructor-led blended learning. It could be for asynchronous e-learning. It could be for asynchronous print-based workbooks, which don't appear a lot in the literature, but they're really cheap and easy to produce. So it could take any form of training. I know right now we're having a U.S. Coast Guard team that's putting together training for people who moor cutters, the Coast Guard ships, when they come into the dock. That's structured on the job training, and we do a lot of that too. Catherine, let me know if I haven't answered your question. You also asked what methods have been the most successful. I don't know what you mean by methods. Sorry to be dense, but if you could clarify, I'll circle back to your question. The other thing that I could offer in terms of preparation is that every week's discussion activity is a risk-free practice, and people take advantage of that opportunity in highly variable ways. Some people will just calibrate a minimum level of work that's enough to get them points but really isn't enough to get them engaging. Um, One of the things about skills training is that it draws a lot on coaching. And this course is about developing ID skills. So this course is a lot about coaching. Your instructor is an ID coach. So whether Dr. Conley or I or someone else is your your ID coach, we can't really help you a lot until we see you do things. And so I'm going to encourage all of you to take advantage of those risk-free practices. Calibrate the time to put your heart, into those activities and give us a due diligence sample of your good work. And the other thing is use those practice opportunities. So if you're off the mark a little bit or a lot in that first attempt, redo your attempt and get additional feedback. We're happy to provide additional feedback. The other thing I would encourage is being uh, comfortable, both as an individual and as a team, to ask for help before or when you need the help, rather than later on when you've slipped or your team has slipped a significant amount of schedule. Both Dr. Conley and I schedule at least 3 meetings with ID project teams with us over the duration of the semester. It's very common for teams to want more. Feel free to ask for additional team meetings as your team feels you need them. Um, and my hope is that you find these preparation bullets helpful uh, in seizing the opportunity, to take advantage of this course and produce the high quality of work that students typically do in this course. So with that, I've gone through everything that was on my little list, uh, and I'm perfectly happy to answer any other questions or address any other concerns that you have. We will be posting these slides with the recording of this webinar, along with the client flyer that I mentioned earlier that you can use to begin qualifying potential projects before the course starts. So yes, we will make the slides available. Are there other questions or comments? Matt asked a little bit more about applying ARCs to ID. All right, let me backtrack here. In the ID course, one of the last deliverables you'll create is an instructional plan. It's the lesson plan for the 2 to 3 hours of training you're going to create. Uh, in addition, in the learner analysis, we'll ask you to begin previewing potential components of the training. And in the preview that appears in the learner analysis and in the instructional plan, we'll be looking that you incorporate both Merrill's first principles as well as aspects of Keller's ARCS model. So what typically happens is that, for example, one of Merrill's points is that there should be a demonstration that shows how exemplary performers complete a task. Here's how you do it. And not only am I going to show you how to do it as I do it, I'm going to call out what's critical, what's difficult, what's complex. One part of that demonstration, so I can work in relevance, is I'm going to also say, here's how it's going to benefit you individually. It's not about making the organization happy. It's about what's in it for me, because relevance in Keller's ARCS model is about what matters to the individual and not the larger organization. In the application phase, there's going to be a series of practice exercises. And after people complete that series, they're going to be ready to show that they've mastered the objective by completing a performance assessment, a mastery assessment. One of the things in Merrill's first principles that you're going to want to address is called the varied problems corollary. And that just means that learners have had enough experiences doing their job task in the training environment that we can expect them to be able to do that in the workplace environment. If I meet that varied problems corollary, odds are I'm also meeting Keller's confidence portion of ARCS by making sure that people feel confident. Hey, I did this in my training and now I can do this on my job. Did that answer your question, Matt? So we're running a little late. I'd like to thank you all for your time and for your interest. Thank you for your kind comments. If you have other ideas for how to make this more useful for you, please get a hold of me. And thank all of you for being here today.
Steve, have you got time for one more? Adam
Yes.
just posed a really good one in the chat. He's struggling with understanding systems and systemic approaches, as well as systematic.
Cool. Yes, and Catherine chimes in, me too. Uh, Systematic and systemic come into pretty much everything we look for in OPWL. So it's part of what we're going to be looking for in the 537 course, and it's going to be part of what we look for in the other project-based courses, and it's going to be part of what we look for in the portfolio defense for those of you who are in the MS program and not just completing a certificate with us. Systematic, in Steve's view of the universe, I know people use the term step by step. I tend to think of it a little bit differently. I tend to think of it as a series of steps where the output of one step or activity becomes the input of the next activity. And so if you look at the bid model that I brought up here, what you can see is that you could argue that bid is systematic in that analysis leads to design, design leads to development, and so on. You could also look at systematic in that the completion of a performance analysis provides information that's used as an input in a learner analysis. The information in the performance analysis and additional data collected from exemplary performers helps teams to create a task analysis. As teams go into design, they start using these analysis documents as inputs for writing objectives, for developing an authentic performance assessment, and for developing an instructional plan. So that's how systematic works in 537. Systemic is really important because you have to be both systematic and systemic. And the reason why is that you can go off course and just be wildly wrong by being systematic alone. What typically happens, and people who have experience in the field, when they get together like me, we share scars and battle stories about what happens when we inherited a bad task analysis from somebody else. So the purpose of a task analysis is to represent how exemplary performers do something in the workplace. If that representation is off target, meaning that it's incomplete, meaning that it's inaccurate, meaning it's not really what people are doing, we're in big trouble because we base the objectives we're going to write on that task analysis. And if the task analysis is faulty, the objectives are going to be faulty. Then we write the performance assessment based on the objectives. So here's a gift that keeps on giving. So if I have a bad task analysis, it's going to plague me. And I use that verb intentionally when I write the instructional objectives, and it will plague me again when I write the assessment instrument, because the systematic approach means that the output of one becomes the input of the next. And this becomes one of those unwanted gifts that keep on giving. what's the counterbalance? What's the check and balance for this systematic approach? And that's the systemic stuff. And there are a couple ways to look at systemic. One way to look at systemic is what are the components of a system and how do they work together? And what are the different levels of a system? So in an ID project, the components of the system include learners, they include clients, they may include customers, they may include other stakeholders in the organization. And by working, by understanding how those folks work together in the organization and how you'll work with them to create the training, what you have is that ability to see things that somehow or another aren't quite right. It's that systemic stuff that helps you realize that you could be going off course, and what helps you guard against that systematic gone wrong where, faulty outputs become inputs that become errors that are repeated and repeated. Adam, did I answer your question? Another way that systemic stuff comes into play uh, is using aspects of the system to determine where and how you're going to collect data. So in the analysis phase, you'll be collecting data to complete a performance analysis. You'll be collecting data to complete a learner analysis, and you'll be collecting other forms of data to complete a task analysis. A knowledge of the uh, client organization and the different parts of that organization and who's in it and what they do should be guiding how you collect data. Because if you don't collect data from the relevant components of the system, you're not going to be able to cross check the data. Now, to get out of ID speak, the whole idea is to collect evidence and to corroborate evidence. This is a lot like working like a detective. And so a good detective doesn't just use one source of evidence. A good detective will take DNA evidence and corroborate that with witness testimony and corroborate that with known timelines. And they'll use that to make a decision about important things like, am I talking to a witness or are you really a suspect? And I learned that from working with cops. They're fun to work with. What a great population. Uh, but systemic helps you be more that good detective that's collecting those different pieces of evidence and putting them together in ways that make sense. Because quite often, clients and managers have no idea how work gets done. And they will believe things that may not necessarily be true in the workplace. Participants may know how they're getting their jobs done, but they may not know about the fact that they're not doing them in ways that meet business goals. Exemplary performers may tell you about what they think it is they're doing, but you have to validate what it is because otherwise it's like getting a recipe from a good cook. And even though they're trying to be helpful, you can't necessarily trust what they're giving you. So the other advantage of this systemic approach is that by collecting all these different data sources, all these different types of evidence, and triangulating them, which is a fancy word for saying corroborating the evidence, you're able to make good decisions about what's actually going on here and how are we going to address that. And so, again, systemic is really important because without systemic, we can just blindly repeat the same mistake again and again. And the thing about the Addy model is the mistakes become increasingly expensive as we go through the model. So a mistake in analysis, let's say, cost $100. By the time it hits design, that mistake may be $800 to $1,000. By the time it hits development, that may be 10 to 100,000. If it hits implementation, we may be talking about millions or more. And so systemic helps us, make sure that we're not filtering bad mistakes and rippling them in our systematic approach. And Pam asks, is it correct to say that it would be hard to work systemically if you don't know how work gets done across the organization? And my answer to that is yes. And not only yes, but what a great question. If you go back to this performance improvement model, One of the things that appears in performance analysis, it's the box on the lower left-hand side of the performance analysis. They call that an environmental analysis. And if you look at that, that's how stuff gets done in terms of different levels. You know, what's happening to the people doing the work, the teams or the groups that they work in, the workplace, the organization, what are larger societal things. If I don't know how my gap fits into that picture of the organization and how it's working, I have a really hard time being systemic, and I have a very hard time doing anything that an organization values. Uh, One of my favorite sources on that environmental analysis, and sometimes people call it an environmental scan, sometimes they call it business acumen. My favorite term for that box is called organizational intelligence. Again, I used to do work in national security. Organizational intel is about how the organization works, and useful organizational intel helps you work the organization. And so there's a marvelous book by Ken Silber and Lynn Kearney. And if you want to learn more about, you know, how to do this organizational intelligence stuff, I highly recommend this book by Ken Silber and Lynn Kearney.
Steve, I feel like we're just getting warmed up. So obviously we have to have you plan another one of these with an opportunity for sort of next layer of questions.
Uh, I think so. And I can also answer Adam's question. And then after that, I really do need to prepare for another commitment. So Adam asked, would you say that constantly evaluating how is it going is a systemic way of working to reach a goal? And yes, I would. Reflection is one of those really cool things. In the military, they call them after action reviews. And the idea is to look at stuff and say, how did that go? How can we make it better? And I think when you reflect that way, both on the deliverables you've created, your relationship with the client, how your team is working, I think teams that do a lot of reflection tend to outperform teams that don't. And the reason why is I think the team helps them make improvements to how they'll work systematically, how they'll work systemically. Uh, and I think that reflection is really key. The other thing that I know as a former project manager type and former chief learning officer is that your ID bosses will cut you a lot of slack if they know that you are always continuously trying to reflect and improve on what you're doing. And if that works its way into the comments they hear from you, the things that you provide them in terms of status reports, in terms of design notes that you may include in project deliverables, two things happen. One, you make them happy by not surprising them. They don't like being surprised, especially bad surprises. And when you surprise them, they're tempted to micromanage you, and you don't want that. But the other thing is that when teams are actively engaged in this, how's it going, this active reflection, this active continuous improvement, and they're really working the system and how they improve the components of the system and the functioning of the overall system, they will give you more street cred than they would otherwise if they think you're being a little timid or you're running scared. So I think the systemic stuff, you have to have systematic and systemic together. One without the other is really dangerous. I could be really systemic, but if I don't have a way to carve out a project, I'm never going to get it done. It's like that old joke about how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. Systematic is our one bite at a time. And systemic is, making sure that we're eating the right bite at the time. And so that was systematic and systemic boiled down to one bad analogy with an elephant. And so with that, oh, Pam, you're too kind. I don't think it's lovely. That was probably one of the worst metaphors ever. Uh, So with that, I thank you all. We'll do this again. I'll work with Linda and I'll work with Quincy Conley and Brandolin, and we'll schedule another one of these probably in the fall, maybe sooner. If you have any ideas about how to improve this, please email the two, Linda and me. This has been good for me and hopefully good for you as well. And thank you for freeing time in what I know are really busy schedules to play with us today. Thank you. Thank all of you.
Yes, and Steve, thanks so much for coming and making time for this. It was certainly interesting and valuable for me, and I can tell from people's comments that it was for them as well. And just one comment more for when you're sending thoughts about this. One of the challenges is figuring out when to post these, when we can schedule these so that we are not overburdening students, sort of making the whole work-life school balance further out of kilter. So thoughts about during the week, weekends, semester breaks, over the summer, what would be best for you? That would be really helpful.
Yes, please. And with that, I'm going to end this webinar and look forward to seeing all of you in 537 and in our future webinars as well. Thank you for your time and your participation.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.